workshop. And today's topic is From Connection to Community to Career. And I just wanted to let all of you know, especially if you're joining us for the first time or would want to see a recording of this or past workshops we've done in the series, we are in the process of putting all of these up on the GSAS YouTube channel. So we'll be emailing you with those links in the next week or two, so you can review past ones if you want. And we'll be putting this one up, and then the following, our last workshop is this Friday, and that'll eventually be up there too. So just wanted to start today again, for those of you joining us for the first time, or a reminder of who we are. We, and when I say we, it's myself, Rachel Bernard, and Francesca Finelli, who's the Associate Director of GSAS Compass, which is Career Development Services for master's and doctoral students and recent graduates of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. This is the kind of event that we're going to be doing forever in the future now, as well as networking events, employer sessions. And beginning next Wednesday on July 1st, Francesca and I will be available for one-on-one advising sessions. And you can check our website toward the end of this week for availability to schedule appointments in July. And as I mentioned, this is the third workshop in a series focusing on things you can do this summer during the pandemic and the economic downturn, although we're already seeing some things picking up. But just thinking about how to use your time this summer for what you can do to advance your job search and your career. We've already talked about the first few in past workshops. So first, continue applying if you're applying for positions right now. It's a great time to explore and research careers. Review your online presence. So this was last week's workshop with Francesca on LinkedIn, both updating your profile and using it to expand your network and make more connections. Today's workshop is going to build on that by taking it a couple of steps further on building relationships. So now that you have an expanded network in LinkedIn and in other ways, how you can build on that and go from, as we're saying, from connection to professional community to career. And on Friday is going to be the last workshop on polishing your job search materials, so your resumes, your cover letters. And the last thing that it's a great time to build skills, learn, there's lots of online courses you can do or tutorials, and that's another great thing that you can do this summer and right now. So first, for today's topic, from connection to community to career. So we didn't use the phrase informational interview in the description for this workshop, but that's basically what we're talking about. Is going from using informational interviews to go from connections, so maybe someone who you've connected with on LinkedIn but never met, someone who you have been introduced to or maybe met once at a conference. So how to go from that connection to thinking about building a professional community to finally using that to advance your career and to build your professional identity. And so today we're going to be talking about how to use informational interviews to do that. And so that's really going to be what we're going to be talking about. So first, we're going to define an informational interview, talk about what it is, why they're good things to do, who you should interview, most importantly, how to do it. And then we'll end by talking about next steps to take after the workshop ends today. And as usual, we'll answer questions at the end. If you do have questions at any point during the workshop, please privately message them to my colleague, Francesca Finelli, and she will collate them and will answer them at the end. So, informational interviews. I did a Google image search for informational interview, and these are some of the top images I found. But first, before we go into defining what it is, I just want to take a quick audience poll. Have you ever conducted an informational interview? Yes, no, or not sure. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. A few more people. Have you ever conducted an informational interview? And we have, okay, so a little more than half of you have. And then the rest evenly split between never have and you're not sure, which is great. So maybe we'll clarify what an informational interview is and you'll realize that you have done one before. Another quick poll. Have you ever been an informational interviewee? Okay, it's always kind of a fun moment in one's career and professional life when you go from being the interviewer to the interviewee, and it's great to see that many of you have been. And maybe I remember in graduate school, I was an interviewee sometimes because people wanted to know what it was like to be in my PhD program, and so I would get an email every so often to talk to someone. So let's see, we'll end the poll and share the results. So a good chunk of you have been an interviewee, many of you have not, and a higher percentage of you are not sure, which doesn't surprise me. So let's talk about, that's great to know from the beginning. So let's talk about what is an informational interview. So an informational interview is a brief meeting between a person who wants to investigate a career, so that would be you, the interviewer, and a person working in that career, and that would be the interviewee. So I think this is one thing that confuses people sometimes, is that the person interviewing, who's conducting the interview, is the person who's exploring a career or applying for jobs. So it's kind of the reverse of what you usually think about in a job interview, where the person who is applying for the job is the interviewee, and the person that works for the organization is the interviewer. So it's kind of the reverse. Key features of an informational interview: they're typically pretty short conversations, 20 to 30 minutes. They can happen over any medium. You know, often they're in person if possible, but even in non-COVID times, it's pretty common to do it over the phone because the person might be in a different city, in a different location, or it's just too difficult to meet up during the workday. And video conference, which is going to be more and more common now. And again, finally, I just want to emphasize, you are the interviewer. So you are the one who is leading the conversation and who's really driving it. So going back to this slide of images, I think these images all tell important things about and show important things about key features of an informational interview as well. So first of all, these are all one-on-one conversations. If you look at all of the images, we can assume that the person who's looking at the laptop is talking to just one person. These are all in person. These are all pre-COVID photos, but I think it's easier to kind of show what's going on in in-person photos. If you kind of look at the people in the photos, you can see what they're wearing, that they're dressed in what we would call business casual attire. So nobody's wearing a suit and tie, but they all are, you know, look like they put themselves together a little bit. People are smiling and talking and using hand gestures and really showing that they're focused and engaged on what the other person is talking about. Most of the people have notes in front of them in some form or another, a notepad or a laptop, so you can tell that they're going to be writing down things that they're learning. Sometimes these conversations are over coffee. Sometimes it looks like they're in an office or maybe at an event where multiple people are having like informational interview rounds. So I think all of these images themselves say a lot about what an informational interview is and the tone of the informational interview. So why do it? What are you trying to get out of an informational interview? So lots of things. So it is a way to explore careers, and that was the topic of the first workshop in the series, and I kind of mentioned informational interviewing then, that it's a way, I think I talked about gaining vicarious experience through an informational interview. So you can learn about an industry, a particular organization or company, or a job function. You know, I've been interested in development or grant writing, but I don't really know what that is. Can you tell me? And that's something you can learn through an informational interview. You can also learn about someone else's career path, and you can use this information to inform decisions about your own path and your next steps. So you can ask, you know, how did you get to where you are, and what would you recommend? And so it can help you kind of think about, if you're talking to someone who's a little bit further advanced in their career, how they got to where they are and how you can use that information. You can also find out information about a particular job market and get insider information. So you can ask things like, what is the hiring timeline like? Like, if I'm looking for a job, if I'd like to be employed by the time I graduate, when is the ideal time to start looking? How does the hiring cycle work? You could ask, what are hiring managers really looking for in this kind of, I looked at position descriptions and I've looked at the required qualifications, but when you get a resume and cover letter in front of you, what are you really looking for? So that's what I mean by insider information. What makes a candidate stand out? That's a good question to ask. You can also identify skill and knowledge gaps that you have. So are you prepared to enter this field? Is there experience you don't have that you should get, or skills that are really valued that you don't have? And again, you can use this information to immediately start looking into how to boost those skills and that knowledge. And then there's some kind of soft things you get out of an informational interview. So gain confidence about your professional identity. And I just think that the more experience you have having professional conversations, especially when it's not a high stakes conversation like a job interview, that it'll just make you more confident and better able to represent your own professional identity. And the same thing goes for the more you hear about other people talking about themselves, it'll really help you present yourself, your professional self. And then the last couple of things, so find opportunities, and a very important parenthetical, eventually. So you'll hear me say this a few times today, but you should never go into an informational interview with the idea that you're going to ask for a job, or find or learn about an actual job by the end of it. So it's really, informational interviews are part of the long game of networking, where eventually, as you expand your network and deepen your connections, eventually you will become more aware of more opportunities. And this is something that eventually happens. But this, in this time, it could also be kind of informal opportunities, or, it could be that you have a great conversation with someone and they say, oh, we might have, we're not hiring right now, but we have, this one project I'm working on, and could use something. So something might come out of it, but it is very important. It's a cardinal rule of informational interviewing to never ask for a job. And finally, informational interviews can help you expand your network, which eventually leads to more opportunities and, I think, a fuller, more rewarding career when you have this network. I'll share that it's funny, this morning, as I was putting the finishing touches on this presentation, I got an email out of the blue from somebody who's in my professional network, who I've had contact with maybe every 6 months for the past few years. And she reached out to me. She saw that I had started a new job. And she actually recently, someone had asked her to do an informational interview. And apparently the person at the end asked the question you should always ask, which is there anyone else you can put me in touch with? And this person gave my name. And so then she reached out to me and said, would you mind doing an informational interview? And I just wanted to share that example as like a way, these kinds of things happen from time to time. And it's just a great way to expand your network. So I now want to do a quick, before I move on, a quick quiz. And this, it'll come in the form of a poll. So these are a series of questions gauging what you think about things that are appropriate during an informational interview, or maybe appropriate, and things that are not appropriate. So I've launched the poll, and I'll give you a couple minutes because there are a few questions. And it's anonymous, so don't be shy. What do you think are appropriate questions and behaviors, and what do you think are not appropriate? Okay, I'm going to close this in a few more seconds. Most of you have voted, and I think 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I ended the poll, and I'm actually not going to talk about it yet. I'm going to talk about the results later. It's kind of a pre-post test. I'll see if Zoom is going to let me do that. So we'll bookmark that and talk about those later. But I think preliminary results look pretty good, that most people guessed or knew right. But for now, we will continue. And some of the answers will be shared, and I've already given some of the answers. But just to reiterate what informational interviews are and what they are not, they are a way to gather information and to inform your current job search and to make and develop professional relationships. And as a reminder, they are not a way to ask about job opportunities. They are not a way to get your foot in the door once you have applied for a position. And so this is kind of a tricky one, that timing matters when you ask for an informational interview. So it would not be appropriate to apply for a job and then email the hiring manager for that job to ask for an informational interview after you've already submitted your application. That would not really be an appropriate use of an informational interview. It could be appropriate to ask someone else in the organization, especially if it's a large organization. After you've applied, it could be appropriate to approach someone else for an informational interview. But in general, that's also not how you want to think of it. It's really just information. It shouldn't be attached to a particular job. And finally, they are not a way to get personal advice. And sometimes the line between personal and professional blurs. But for example, if you're interested in an organization that's in a different city, you can ask the person about a little bit about, okay, what's the organization like? What's your position like? What is the city like? But you shouldn't really get into, oh, I can't decide if I want to relocate my family, and like that's the kind of thing that's kind of too personal for an informational interview. So that's also not appropriate. So next, the really important question of who should you talk to? And last week, Francesca talked about comfortable connections and warm connections. And these are really good places. This is where you should start in thinking about who you should talk to for an informational interview. So first, on the left there, you see comfortable connections. And these are people who you'd be comfortable already having a conversation with. Obviously, your family, your friends, peers or former classmates, former colleagues and employers, perhaps your advisor. And this is interesting. I find that sometimes when I'm talking to students, you think of your friends and family as non-professional connection. It's purely personal. But they have jobs, they've had careers, and they also have other connections. And so I've actually had some really meaningful conversations and really helpful career conversations with, for example, like a friend who I went to high school with, who I've known for actually even before then for like 30 years. And our professional lives only kind of started to intersect recently, and have had some really helpful conversations with her. That's just a totally personal connection. Or family who, I was relocating to New York City, and their kind of family of family lived here already, and so they became part of my professional network in that way. So I would start with comfortable connections, and also with warm connections. And so warm is slightly less comfortable than comfortable, but still someone that you could reach out to. So alumni, and Francesca has mentioned this in last week's presentation too, that think not only about Columbia, but also any other institution that you've attended. Professional association members. So as a student, you can often get very discounted rates for professional associations, and reaching out to anybody in that association to ask for an informational interview is a great idea. Guest speakers and event participants. So if you go to a talk or go to a panel, reaching out to someone who participated is a great idea. And it's also a really nice introductory email. I saw you present on this topic recently, and I would love to learn more and schedule an informational interview with you. So that's great. And then volunteer mentors, that could be like if you're part of a professional association, people who are on lists volunteering to serve as mentors, or in any other kind of affinity group that you're part of. And then second degree LinkedIn contacts. And this is what Francesca talked about last week. You can see people through different searches you can do on LinkedIn, people who are second degree, meaning you are already connected. You have one person in common, at least one person in common as an actual LinkedIn connection. And it's just much easier to get introduced and use that mutual connection as a way of contacting someone. So these are all people to start with. So what I'd like all of you to do now is use the chat and chat to everyone. One person, and when I say person, I don't mean the person's name, but the person's relationship to you, who you plan to do an informational interview with. So it could be like, my former boss, or someone I heard at this talk, or friend from high school. But just thinking about yourself right now and who in your network, okay, a professor, someone wrote in, great. Former TA, thanks, Francesca. Great, alumni from a career panel, junior faculty, great idea. A curator that my advisor knows, great. So yeah, a second degree connection. A friend of a professor, yeah, a lot of second degree. A former colleague who has changed companies, that's a great strategy too. A friend who runs a nonprofit, friend from undergrad. So fantastic. These are all exactly the kind of comfortable and warm connections that are a great place to start for informational interviews. Okay, so before contacting someone for an interview, so this is after you have decided on a person or a few people who you'd like to do informational interviews with, write those names down and then ask yourself a few questions. So why do you want to contact this person? What specific information do you want to get out of the conversation? Why this person? What relevant information do you need to tell this person about yourself for the conversation to be productive? And we'll talk in a minute about how to introduce yourself, because that's critical and you might want to highlight different things depending on who you're talking to. And next, do we have a mutual contact? And so this is all of you, kind of comes with the thinking process of who you're going to ask, but again, that's just really helpful and a good thing to mention when you're actually reaching out. And next, do a bit of research. So where does the person work? You probably already know that. And just a little bit about that organization if you're not as familiar with it, and then what their current job is, and what their career path has been. And this doesn't have to be in a tremendous amount of detail, but basically just use LinkedIn to become familiar with their career path. You don't want to enter the conversation and know nothing about them. You want it to be clear that you've done a bit of research about them beforehand. Okay, so this is a sample email one might send to request an informational interview. And everything that's highlighted in red or in red font is there for a very important reason. So you'll see this, the email is pretty short and every single word matters and is there for a reason. So first, the subject line, request for informational interview. It's very important to be clear and direct about why you're contacting them. Usually people, so dear Ms. Jones, it's often appropriate not to use the first name, but to use an honorific. So professor, doctor, Ms., Mr. Again, if it's a friend, obviously you wouldn't have to use that. I hope this finds you well. So it's nice to begin with a pleasantry, and especially you might do like a COVID specific, I hope this finds you safe and healthy or something. Then jump right in, introduce yourself. I'm a graduate student in whatever program. That's a great way to start. At Columbia University, and I am exploring transitioning to a career in media. Okay, next, I noticed your profile. So how did you learn of the person? So that could be, I noticed your profile on College Art Association's professional development page, or you may not remember me, but I took a class from you in college, or you were my TA, or a friend, suggested that I reach out to you, say how you became aware of the person. And I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about your career path and experience. So what are you asking for? And then it's good to close out that first paragraph with just a little bit more information about yourself and your background, but one sentence is enough. Finally, the ask in the second paragraph. And it's very important to be specific. Would you be willing to schedule an informational interview on Zoom? So what are you asking for and what medium are you asking? You could say Zoom, or you could say video conference or phone. It would be great if you could spare 20 to 30 minutes at a time that is convenient for you. So that's another critical thing, is you want to work around their schedule as much as possible. And then next week or the following week. So it's also, I find it's really good to give a specific time frame, because if you just say, at a time that is convenient for you, period, then especially as someone who's been an interviewee a number of times, then I don't prioritize that email and I forget to respond, basically. But if it's like next week or the following week, that prompts me to look at my calendar and actually think about scheduling this. And then finally, close with thank you for considering my request, and I hope we can meet in the near future. So I think Francesca has copied this text into the chat. Great, thank you. So you can feel free to copy and paste that, and we'll provide it in the recording too. So you can use this as kind of a template for an email that you might send. Okay, so after you've sent that, and I'll just say, I was gonna say this later, but I'll say it now, that so you send this email, what should you expect for a response? So in an ideal world, the person responds to you within 2 to 3 days and you get it scheduled. That happens a lot of the time, but not all the time. You know, people are really inclined. I basically always say yes when someone asks for an informational interview. It's nice to meet other people. I consider it as an opportunity to expand my own network when somebody asks me for an informational interview, and I often learn from the conversation too. You know, I did an informational interview recently with someone who recently graduated with a PhD from another university, and I was just very curious in a different field from my own, and I was, you know, she wanted information from me, but I also just wanted to know kind of more about her world, and so I was very inclined to say yes. So usually the person will say yes within a few days, and you'll schedule something, but also sometimes people don't reply, and I just really want to emphasize to not take this personally, that people are busy. I think this is an excellent time to do informational interviews in general, like the summer and the COVID isolation context, but you just never know if someone's on vacation, if someone has other stuff going on. So absolutely don't take it personally. And I say usually at most you could follow up once, 1 week later, if it's really someone you'd like to talk to, with a very, very brief follow-up, or but I wouldn't follow up more than that, because you don't want to seem like you're really hounding the person for an informational interview. So give the person a week to reply, a week to 10 days. If you don't hear back, you could do a little nudge. And if they still don't get back to you, you can let that go and make a note of it and maybe reach out again in a couple months. Okay, so once you've sent that email and you have the interview scheduled, how should you prepare? So first, do even more research. Make sure that you're, again, fully aware of the person, or as aware as you can be of, you know, if they have a LinkedIn presence or other presence online, so be aware of their career trajectory and their current position. So that means research what the organization is doing and just, you know, the person's title. Next, write down a list of questions, and we'll talk about that in a minute for what are good questions for an informational interview. But write them down and bring your questions with you, as well as a pen to take notes. The next thing, have an updated version of your resume ready to share afterwards. So I generally don't think it's appropriate to bring a resume to an informational interview unless it's someone who you really know pretty well already. But I think especially if it's someone you're meeting for the first time, I think a better approach is to have a resume ready so that if it comes up during the conversation that the person would be willing to review your resume or, you know, take a quick look at it, you have it ready so that that evening or the next day you can email it to them afterward. So it's good to have it ready, and luckily enough, this Friday, Francesca is going to be doing a workshop on how to get that resume ready. But I do think it's good to have ready just in case. Next, think about what you're going to wear. So right now, these are very likely to happen over, you know, video conference. And there's a little graphic here about what business casual attire is, and you saw it in all those photos earlier. That it's usually no tie, but definitely a nice blouse, shirt, or jacket or something. Especially if people are going to be seeing you from the waist up. And if you're going to be in person, then you can think about the full, you know, what you're going to wear, the full ensemble. If, you know, it is possible you could do an informational interview outdoors right now, and think about, you know, if it's hot out, still you want to be dressed in an appropriate way, something that you would wear to an office. Next, prepare your 1-minute introduction. And this we're going to talk about on the next slide. And as I said earlier too, your intro might vary a little bit depending on who you're talking to. So how are you going to introduce yourself? And again, this is important because remember, you're directing the conversation. So when you sit down or when you start your Zoom call, you're the one, the other person is expecting you to talk first, and they're expecting you to lead the conversation and make it clear what you're doing there. So so you can begin by, I suppose first, thank you for your time. Thank you for meeting with me, and then introduce yourself. And usually things you'd want to mention are, especially if you're a current student, what you're studying, and why you're interested in this field, and kind of connecting what you're currently doing and what you've done before with this other person's career. And in addition, you might mention some relevant experience you've had, and then any relevant information you've gotten already. So you might say, I already spoke to this person and that person, and I learned, I already learned a little bit about this field, and I wanted to talk to you so that I could learn a little bit more, something like that. You don't want your introduction to be more than 1 minute. So it doesn't need to be, because you're having a conversation, you're getting ready to talk for 20 or 30 minutes. So you'll be telling them more about yourself. But just think about what are the most important things to start with, so that the person knows why you're having this conversation and why you might be interested in this career. So these days, when I am an informational interviewee, a lot of the people I'm talking to are people who have PhDs, who are finishing a PhD program, who want to transition, especially in my old job, I worked at a nonprofit as a program officer, and so a lot of those people who are interested in working for foundations or nonprofits, or in higher ed administration. And so usually they'll say, I'm finishing my PhD, and I'm really interested in working at a university, but not as a faculty member, because in graduate school I've been involved in putting together conferences, or I had a small internship in an office on my campus, and it really made me interested in pursuing this as a career path. So that might be, something that somebody would say, and they're introducing themselves. And then they might say, especially, this other person introduced, told me that I should contact you because she works at a kind of parallel organization or in a different role in higher ed administration. And now I'm curious, to hear your perspective. So these are like the kinds of things that would go into an introduction. And then after you introduce yourself, you should end with your first question, because again, you're the one who is driving the conversation here. So, and that question, it could be something specific. It could be, I've seen your profile on LinkedIn, and I know a little bit about your past, but I'm wondering, often when I'm the interviewee, the first question is, can you tell me a little bit more about how you got to your current role? That's often, I would say, the first question that gets asked. But here are some more questions. And again, there are many, many questions you could ask. Here are 10 common ones, kind of in order of how they might appear in an actual informational interview. How did you get started in this field or position? Can you tell me a bit more about your trajectory? What is the most rewarding part about your work? What is the most challenging? What is a typical day, month, year like? I often get the question, what is a typical day like? And in many jobs, there is no typical day. And so I just find it as an interviewee to be, I always, if I get that question, I spin it into what is a typical month or year like, because it's, usually the jobs that I've had, it varies so much. What experiences, skills, personality characteristics does your organization look for in new hires? And again, this can help you get at skills or experience that you would need to build. And then just kind of more, specific things about the office culture. Where do you see yourself next is an interesting one. You wouldn't want to ask very senior people that question, but if it's someone who's a few years ahead of you in their lives and careers, then that's kind of an interesting question that can help you think about trajectory. And then asking for advice. And then finally, do you have any other contacts you would be willing to connect me with? And I think that is a pretty critical one. So I'd say the two most critical questions usually are asking someone a bit more about their own background and trajectory, and then ending by asking if they'd be willing to connect with others. And it could either be, yes, and they're going to give you specific names right then, which is why it's great to have a pen and paper. But that could also be fodder for a post-interview email follow-up to say, oh, thank you so much again for offering to connect me with these folks. Would you mind, introducing me or sharing their email addresses with me? That would be appropriate. So these are all great questions to ask, but there are many, many more. So now, what I would like you all to do is I'm going to put you in breakout rooms just to do really for just a few minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, and you'll most people are back now. Okay, so I hope that you were able to share a little bit and maybe bounce ideas off of the other person. I always find it helpful just to talk about that kind of thing with other folks too. So what to do after the interview? So a couple critical things to do: send a thank you email and connect with the person on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. With a personalized message, also thanking them for the interview. So, and here's sample text that you can use. Dear whoever, and usually at this point you're on a first name basis with the person. Thank you for taking the time. So obviously the first thing is to thank them. It's a thank you email. Say something nice about how much you enjoyed the conversation. And then it's nice to insert a couple of specific things in the thank you email. Specific things you found helpful, something specific you're planning on doing to follow up. This, both signals to the person that you were really paying attention, and also it just kind of reminds them again of the conversation, and so that helps to kind of really get that in, like, because one of the things you want out of this is you want the person to remember you and think of you if they hear of something. So it's good to be, again, concise and brief, but also have a couple of specific things in that thank you email. And as I've mentioned, it can also be a nice time, at the end, thank you again, and I hope to keep in touch. And the next slide will talk about how to do that. But again, this is also a place where you could say, I hope to keep in touch, or thank you again for offering to connect me with so-and-so and so-and-so. Would you be willing to connect me over email or share their email address? Or if you didn't get a chance to ask that during the interview, would you be willing to connect me with other folks? And again, it's if you can be a little bit specific about the kinds of connections you're looking for, you'll get the most out of it and you'll make it easiest on the person. Okay, so another critical thing is staying in touch. And this is how you go from connection to community. That, if you just have one informational interview with someone, that person is not really part of your network. It's all about following up and staying in touch. And I think that's one of the hardest parts. And so how do you do it? First, follow up. And again, I'm very conscious of not wanting to seem like you're hounding someone. So I think timing is important here. If you meet with someone, send a follow-up thank you email. You don't want to email them again the very next week. It's just, unless you have very good reason to, but that's kind of a little too much. So instead, I suggest waiting a few weeks. And I say 1 to 3 months. 3 months is probably the longest you'd want to wait. But send them a personal email or a personal LinkedIn message with some piece of new information. So it could be maybe you have an update, maybe you got a position, or you got an internship, or there's something that's relevant that person would be interested in. So share the update. If you don't have an update, you could just share an article that you saw or something that you think the person would be interested in. And then it's always good to end that email with a quick question so that you're asking for some kind of reply from them. You could ask, and again, like with COVID, it's kind of always easy to ask a question about, how are things going with the organization? New York City entered phase 2 today, like has your office reopened? Or, specific questions you could ask about that. Or something about, how is the specific project going? Or again, it's just nice to end with a question so that it encourages them to reply. And then reach out again with a little bit less frequently. So maybe think about it like every quarter or something. And here, it's important to continue to build on the relationship in your correspondence and not to repeat things. It's always nice to offer, start with, I hope you're doing well. I hope this message finds you well, and offer to help. And again, it might feel empty. You might feel like, I don't know how I could help this person, but it's common courtesy, and you never know. And when you could actually have something, especially as a student, people, nobody knows kind of what's going on at universities, at least from the student perspective, like a student does. And so you do have something to offer, and it's always nice to offer that to people. And finally, keep a record of your correspondence. And so this is where, especially if you're really doing a good number of informational interviews, keep track of who you've talked to. You know, a simple spreadsheet will do. Keep track of when, and if you need to, what you've talked about, so that you can keep track of all of that. One last thing I'll say about that too is you don't have to stay in touch with everybody you do an informational interview with. Sometimes it's, you know, the conversation is perfectly pleasant, but just not that helpful, or you decide to go in a different direction. And in that case, send a thank you email, but you actually don't need to do any other follow-up. So don't feel like, you know, every single person you do an informational interview with, you need to follow the schedule. I find that it's actually a minority of people who I do an informational interview with who then really become part of my network, and who I do this regular follow-up with. Otherwise, it's, you know, a pleasant conversation, not at all a waste of time. Send a thank you email, and then, you know, you don't have to keep in touch. So I know that can feel burdensome to people. Okay, so now I actually just want to go back and share the results of the poll that we did at the beginning, to see, to remind you of the questions and go over them. So is it appropriate to email someone you don't know to ask for an informational interview? Most of you thought it was appropriate, and yes, it is absolutely appropriate. You can use the template that I shared earlier. Is it appropriate to ask for someone's salary during an informational interview? This one was a little bit trickier. 3/4 of you thought it's not appropriate. One person thought it is. A few of you thought that you're not sure. And this one's a tricky one. There are ways of ascertaining. You can ask, first of all, it is not appropriate to ask, what is your salary? How much money do you make? That is not an appropriate question. But you can ask something like, what is the typical salary range in this field? You know, you can ask a general question, but it is not appropriate to ask someone how much money they make. Next, divided here, to ask your interviewee to review your resume during an informational interview. So I, most of the time, think it's not appropriate unless there's special circumstances where maybe you've prearranged that that's going to happen, or it's someone who's like really in like a mentor advisor kind of role. But in general, I think the most appropriate thing to do is to have that resume ready to share afterwards. Next, is it appropriate to ask your interviewee for additional contacts? Everyone said yes, and that's absolutely right. Finally, is it appropriate to ask for a job during an informational interview? It is not appropriate, as most of you already know. So wrapping up here, I like to cover pitfalls, things that people worry about going wrong or that sometimes can go wrong, and how to prevent them. So first pitfall, the person doesn't email me back. And as I already went over, follow up 10 days later with a very brief email, and then give up. And absolutely don't take it personally, just move on. Another pitfall, what if you feel uncomfortable? And my advice here is to remember that this is a normal practice. It might feel weird to you, but it's a really, really normal practice in US work culture. And your interviewee will appreciate that you put yourself out there to ask for this. So you might feel uncomfortable, but it's really, try to just take a deep breath and realize this is normal. It's also normal to feel uncomfortable, and it'll get more comfortable over time. People often worry about awkward silences or pauses in the conversation, and this is where you can really prepare in advance. And I would bring more questions than you have time to ask. Really, in 20 or 30 minutes, you only have time to ask maybe 3 or 4 or 5 questions, but bring a few extra, so that you can fill any awkward silences with another question, or maybe just end it early. if you don't have more to talk about, that's also fine for it to be less than 20 minutes. Another pitfall, if you talk to someone who's really long-winded and not helpful, again, have that list of questions in front of you and try to refocus the conversation without being rude. If the conversation goes on too long, so more than the 30 minutes you've asked for, again, you're the one who's leading this conversation, so it's your responsibility to be keeping track of the time. And so as you're looking at the time, if it's starting to approach 30 minutes, say, I'm aware of the time, do you have, I want to let you go. And then if the person says, oh, no, we can keep talking, only then should it go longer than you've asked for. Last pitfall, you ask for a job and things suddenly get really awkward. Just don't do it, and then you can avoid that one. Okay, so this is the last slide here. So next steps, what should you do this afternoon and later this week? I do suggest, especially if you're like really in the thick of a job search right now, to make a spreadsheet just to keep track. It's kind of a brainstorming spreadsheet, and then also to keep track of the actual interviews you're doing. So, make a list of, sectors you're interested, organizations you're interested in, but then make a list of people too. And it could be a long list, and then you'll prioritize and decide how many people you actually want to do informational interviews with. But I really encourage you to keep track of it and write it down. And next, prioritize and set goals for outreach. So it's easy to kind of think and, make these spreadsheets, but set a goal. And maybe a good goal to start with is, I will reach out to one person this week and just start there. And then set goals, or one person each week until, till the end of July or something like that. And that's, 4 or 5 people that you're going to reach out to. But I think really just starting with one person and saying you're going to do it by the end of the week is a really great goal to start with. Next, work on updating your resume if you haven't already. And then finally, just do it. Start reaching out, send the email. The worst thing that can happen is that you don't get a reply, and that's really not so bad. So I'm going to stop here, and I realize I've only left about 5 minutes. We can go a couple minutes over because we started a couple minutes late. But Francesca, I know you've been collecting questions.
Yes. So I have one question, which was, does this type of job seeking strategy apply to academic positions? And I would say most definitely yes. And because this type of informational interviewing is helpful for learning about the realities of any job. It can be academic, non-academic. It can be, you're just maybe just scratching the surface and interested. So this strategy really works for any type of position. It's just more the people that you reach out to contact will be different, because then obviously you're going to look for people maybe working in an academic setting, either as a professor or a TA, or, there's a broad range within that area that you can speak to about the types of positions held.
Yeah, definitely. I think networking is really, really important in academia, and people don't talk about it enough. But I think informational interviews, so first of all, you've had a really specific academic experience. I know you're a graduate student at Columbia. I don't know where you went to undergrad, but there are many other kinds of institutions out there that are not research intensive doctoral granting institutions, and that's where the vast majority of people who end up who want to go into academia. So I think doing informational interviews with people who teach at different kinds of institutions can be incredibly helpful. What does it mean to have a 3-3 teaching load, a 4-4 teaching? What does that actually mean? What kinds of classes are you teaching? When you interviewed, what was the interview process like? What were people looking for? Or what was it like to move, if you're talking to a Columbia alum, what was it like to move from New York City to, insert remote place? I don't want to offend where anybody's from. But I think absolutely they can be helpful in gathering information and in expanding your network. And again, once you're a faculty member, networking is so important to be, to get published, to be invited to present at conferences, thinking ahead to people who write tenure letters. So absolutely, in academia, it's useful and important.
So we actually had 2 more questions come in. So the first one is, if you're reaching out to people at a company that you're applying to, should you reach out and interview before you put in an official application and ask them to refer you, or after you put in the application, can you ask them to refer you? What should the order be? So I think that it kind of really depends, I think. I mean, if you can, so hiring is a very quick process. Sometimes it takes a long time. And if you can find someone at a company that you are interested in and have an informational interview and go that way first, where you find the person, have an informational interview, and ask them to recommend you, that's great, that's wonderful. However, I'd say most likely it's usually the other way around, as Rachel was saying. Like, you don't want to send an email to maybe an HR manager after you've applied, but maybe you find an alum or a mutual contact who actually works there, and then you have an informational interview and you can learn more about the company. And this is a great strategy for if you get an interview, how to prepare. There's no I don't want to give again, a lot of these answers are ambiguous because it's usually very specific to your experience. What I try to encourage all students to do is that this is a process that networking is very long-term. So let's say you're not even looking for a job right now. This is a perfect time to do informational interviewing, because you can start to make a list of companies you're really interested in. And so that hopefully you've done some legwork. So if a position does open there, you've already had an interview with someone at that company, and then they might be able to help refer you. So I don't know. I would say that it's hard to give a straight answer for the exact order. I would say, just as Rachel said, like, just don't send your application after you've applied to an HR manager, because it's probably not going to do that much for you. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that, Rachel?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I would also just say, be careful of getting into the asking for a job territory. Like, if you have an informational interview with someone who's a complete stranger, and then at the end of 20 minutes ask if they would refer you to a job in their organization, that's just, sometimes people aren't so comfortable with that. You know, in my previous job, there was a position open at that organization, and I did have a few people reach out to me for informational interviews. And I had nothing to do with the hiring for that role, and it wasn't in my department. And I had a few people reach out to me for informational interviews, either who had applied already or who were planning on applying. And I think the best way to do it is to just make it very clear, you know, you're just seeking information. You know, it's, I think in general, unless the person is already a comfortable or warm connection, it's kind of hard to ask for that referral. Or, I mean, there's some industries where that's not the case, you know, at really big, like, financial or consulting firms, or, you know, or any kind of big corporation. I think that it's much, you know, it's very easy for someone to just send a quick email to HR or something and, you know, get your resume lifted from the pile. So then that's fine. But if it's a smaller organization, I agree with Francesca that ideally you've already done that networking in advance before the opportunity comes up.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
I have input. From what I know from friends of mine, because I'm looking for a job in big tech companies and like large organizations, sometimes you can't do it that way because it's a privacy thing. So even if I have a good friend at a company, if I apply to a job, they cannot like add a recommendation for me or like a reference from within the company. So I have to go through them. Like I have to, if I want to have a reference from within the company, I need that to come first. Once I apply, there's nothing they can do for me. They can't add anything like, oh, I know her or something like that. Because again, it's a privacy thing. Like the company doesn't want every employee to, you know, go into your information. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's also a good piece of information when I talked about like insider information to get through informational interviewing. But yeah, I think tech, yeah, like these, you know, sectors with bigger employers and corporate employers, I think very commonly do have policies like that and practices like that. And it can be common, you know, in that sector to ask your friends to refer you, or to say, you know, ask your friends, can you introduce me to some of your colleagues so I can talk to them because I want to apply for a job at Google, you know, whatever company it is, and kind of do that legwork in advance. And so that's where I think you can know that through informational interviewing in a funny way. So you can, you know, that's also a really good question to ask in an informational interview. And you can do online research about that as well. So I think we should probably wrap up because we're at time. Does that sound good, Francesca?
Sure. There's just there's one more that's a really easy answer, which is if you don't have someone's email, is it appropriate to ask for an informational interview through LinkedIn? Most definitely. I often don't have people's email addresses, and that's where I find them, is on LinkedIn. So for sure, and it's a great resource for that. We have one more that came in under the hair, but you know what? We can respond via email. So we'll get back to you. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have our last workshop in the series this Friday about revising and perfecting your resumes and cover letters, your job search materials. And as a reminder, every Thursday you can find me and Francesca at Ask Me Anything. If you go on our website, you'll find a link to the Zoom room where we are every Thursday from 10 to 11 Eastern. So thanks again to everybody for coming, and hope to see you again.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.